I think the seagulls have finally decided to shut up. Maybe. Coinus T, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales YouTube channel, where we talk about Irish mythology and culture. Now, we've already talked on this channel about St. Patrick's Day and how it became the big cultural juggernaut that it is today, but St. Patrick was not the only patron saint of Ireland. In fact, there were 3. And today we are going to talk about possibly the least known of them, a saint called Columcille, who, by the way, discovered the Loch Ness monster. And that wasn't even the most important thing that he did. So when I was in school, there was a little rhyme that we had to memorise, in among all of the weird little rhymes that you memorise in primary school. And I don't remember much of it, except that I remember that the refrain was Patrick, Breed and Columcille. And it was about how Ireland had 3 patron saints, and the 3 of them were all buried like side by side in a place called Downpatrick. As I said, we've already talked about St. Patrick on this channel. We've actually also talked about Breed or Bridget, because we've done an explainer video on Imbolc in Ireland, which is the pagan holiday that became St. Bridget's Day and is still celebrated on the island. Columcille, probably because he doesn't have a day, and also partly because he spent a lot of his life in Scotland, doesn't quite have the same degree of prominence these days as the other 2 saints, and so I think a lot of people kind of forget about him. There was at least a period of time in Ireland where he was extremely important, and he was kind of considered co-equal to the other 2. They were the 3 big figures in sort of Irish Christianity. And I think all 3 of them have a really interesting storytelling tradition that has grown up around them, that blends history and folklore and mythology and religion in a really unique way. Not because Ireland is the only country where that happened with saints, but just because it's blending with what was already here in terms of Irish folklore and mythology. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of the time their hagiographies weren't written down until a couple of hundred years after they'd died. Hagiography is like the biography of a saint specifically, as opposed to the biography of a pleb. And that gave them time to kind of grow legs. Columcille had a hagiography that was written about 100 years after he died, and then like another one later that had a lot more stories in it. Dahlia Hogan has a very good breakdown in the Lore of Ireland about like which stories come from which one. I'm not really going to get into that today. I'm just going to try and tell you the story of Columcille in somewhat of a linear fashion. And as ever, I leave it to other people to argue over what is true. I'm just in it for the story. He was born in Ulster. He was part of the Iona sept. His mother was a woman from Leinster called Ethna. A great Irish name that comes up in a lot of Irish mythology. And he was kind of important before he was even born. In one story, his mother received a visitation from an angel before she gave birth, announcing that a great saint was about to be born. She gave birth to him, and the infant's head was surrounded by light. He was educated by a bishop called Finian, who saw an angel accompanying him everywhere he went, which kind of became a little bit of a theme in Columcille's life. There was all of this stuff about him having these incredible angelic visions of angels and demons, and also other people seeing light and pillars of light and angels like surrounding him and around him and preceding him and guarding him. There's a story that he was educated by a priest who gave him a little bite of sweetbread every time he managed to memorize a letter of the alphabet. So if anyone feels guilty about bribing their children to do homework with sweets, don't! It worked for Columcille, and he had angels hanging out with him all the time. Maybe it's really good parenting, actually. His name was not actually Columcille. His given name, rather, was not Columcille. He was named, I think it's pronounced Crivhan, and I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but his original given name was Crivhan. Columcille means dove of the church, so anyone whose name is Colum probably already knows that the name means dove or dove of peace. And kill or killa in Irish is church. He got the nickname Columcille because he spent all of his time in the church. Columcille had all kinds of miracles attributed to him. One of the big threads was this idea that he had angels around him, and also that he could kind of see the hidden world, that there was this world of angels and demons that was like right alongside our world that he was able to see into, that this gave him a prophetic ability. He was able to see visions of the future. He was able to control the weather. He was able to manifest food out of nothing. heal illnesses. And I think that idea of like hidden world is very in line with Irish mythology, this concept of there being an other world filled with gods and monsters that is just alongside ours. I think it kind of is like you can see the way those traditions are kind of enfolding into each other there. I mentioned the other saints, Patrick and Bridget, already, and there's some interesting parallels, I think, particularly with Bridget and Columcille, and some with Patrick as well. Bridget founded a church in an oak wood, which is the origin of the place name of Kildare. Kill meaning church again, Dura meaning oak wood. So she founded the church in the oak wood. Columcille was said to have planted an oak wood and then put a church in there. And that was Dura Columcille, which, if you are from Ulster, you might recognise as being the Irish name of Derry. So the town of Derry was actually founded by Columcille. He planted the oak trees at a time when oak trees were, on the decline in Ireland. So he's also kind of got a little bit of an ecological, eco-saint thing behind him. He also found a monastery in Durrow. He went to Tory Island. Tory Island is this island off the north of Donegal, and it's kind of, in mythology, famously like other. It is supposed to be the home of the Fomorians in the mythological cycle, where the rest of the island is the home of the Tuatha Danann, and they have these great wars between them. And Tory Island has always been like a little bit outside of Ireland and a little bit of a different place. And it was said to also have been a very long-standing holdout against Christianity. And Columcille was the one who flipped it. Columcille was the one who actually converted Tory Island to Christianity. And the way he did it is another little echo of the Bridget story. He went to the king of Tory Island and asked him for enough land to build a monastery. And when the king refused, asked him for only as much as his cloak would cover, and then spread his cloak to cover the whole island. The king was furious and set his hounds on Columcille, who made the sign of the cross in the air and killed the hounds dead. And after that, the people of Tory Island decided to convert to Christianity, and Columcille put a blessing on the earth of Tory Island. He's also associated with Glen Columcille in South Donegal, where it was said to have been occupied by a horde of demons, and Columcille banished all of them and made it into a sanctuary for anyone who was weak or in need. After doing all of these things, he actually left Ireland completely, which I think is one of the reasons why he's less known in Ireland, and he struck out for Iona in Scotland. Iona is an island off the southwest coast of Scotland, and Columcille went there to set up a monastery to minister to the unconverted Pictish tribes and also to Irish people who had migrated to Scotland, because we have been going back and forth for, frankly, as long as there have been people on these islands. In the earliest hagiographies, there is a reference to like some trouble, a very vague reference to him getting in this like trouble that was sort of trivial, that he was excommunicated for by a synod, and there was another saint called Brennan who stood up for him and said that he shouldn't be excommunicated because he was preceded by a pillar of radiant light into the room. And Brennan took this as a sign that he was favoured by God, but that the synod actually excommunicated him. But it doesn't really go into any detail. There are much more interesting stories in the later hagiographies about this. And they also attribute to Columcille the foundation of copyright law as we know it today. Columcille needed to borrow a book from a saint called Finian of Moville, and he made a copy of the book. When Finian found out that Columcille had made the copy of the book, he was really annoyed and really offended. Remember, this was before the printing press. Writing was the new technology in Ireland. Never mind generative AI. And Columcille had copied the book from Finian. Finian was furious and went to the High King. The High King was Dermot MacCurble, and Dermot MacCurble made a controversial ruling that cow is to calf as book is to copy. In other words, because Finian owned the original, Finian owned the copy. And Columcille said that was a bad judgment. And if you look at the state of our modern copyright laws today, maybe you agree with Columcille. He'd probably be very disappointed in us these days. But maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you think it needs to be protected. Maybe cow is to calf as book is to copy. I don't know. Maybe we should argue about this in the comments and drive up engagement. No, that wasn't enough for Columcille to leave on its own. Instead, tensions rose between the saint and the king. Columcille gave sanctuary to a man who Dermot MacCurble wanted to arrest, and Dermot arrested the man and had him put to death, even though he was under Columcille's protection, which was a bit of a slap in the face to like a church authority at the time. Columcille then encouraged the northern Enail to stir up a rebellion against Dermot MacCurble, who was from the southern Enail. So even the tribes of Ireland were not united at this time, and kind of pushed for this uprising to try and overthrow the king. The uprising was not successful, but it was very bloody. And it is said in these stories that it was because of remorse for causing such a bloody war that he actually imposed exile on himself. He swore that he would never set foot on Irish soil again. He swore that he would never eat or drink Irish food. He would never look upon Irish people. And he took himself off to Iona, which arguably is as close as you can get to Ireland without actually still being Ireland. But he was having a big dramatic moment, and he was very dramatic about it forever. This was kind of the penance that he took on himself. So he set out for Iona to do his missionary work to these wild Pictish Scottish tribes, set up his monastery on Iona, and it said that he blessed the soil of Iona so that viper's poison would not work there on men and cattle, which I think is a little bit reminiscent of the Patrick story and the banishing of the serpents, but there'll be more about that later. And while he was in Iona, one of his more famous and dramatic visions happened. He had a vision of one of his monks back in Ireland, back in Durrow, falling out of a high window, and he asked an angel to help the man. And in that moment sent an angel to Durrow who caught the falling monk and carried him down to the ground, saving his life, which would have taken like weeks to verify. Back in the day, no telephones, no communication other than somebody getting in a boat and going to Durrow to check on the guy and come back to Iona and say he was good, he was fine. Actually, an angel turned up. Now, interestingly, Columcille was like this real sort of like otherworldly, saintly being who had all these incredible visions of angels and demons. But interpersonally, he was like kind of short-tempered, and he was kind of like sarcastic, and he could be a little bit of a bollocks, especially with people asking him for help. But at the same time, he was extremely generous, and he was extremely like giving to the poor. That was part of his duties, and he did all these healing miracles. I think he really kind of fits that definition of like somebody who is kind but not nice. Like, he was not interpersonally nice, but he was a very generous and giving person. The story goes that one day, as he was giving out alms to beggars with a really bad grace, he realised that one of the beggars was Jesus himself in disguise, who had come to teach Columcille a lesson after handing who he thought was a beggar a lump of dough. Jesus threw it into the fire and it sprouted back into ears of corn. And ever after that, Columcille had a bit more manners on him when he was dealing with poor people. Because, of course, that is the central credo of Christianity, that whatever one does to any other human being, they are doing directly to Jesus Christ himself. I feel like some of them forget that. Columcille begged forgiveness and was like much reformed in his behaviour after that day. I said something about serpents already, and believe it or not, there's kind of a common trope with saints and serpents in Ireland, particularly with water serpents, great pastes. Now, if you know about St. Patrick, you already know that he is said to have banished all serpents from Ireland. He's not the only one associated with serpents. There's also a tradition that the River Lee in Cork was created when St. Finbar banished a huge water serpent from Gugan Barra, and it drove a course down to the sea as it was trying to escape from the saint. But this whole trope in Irish saint stories, which is a whole thing, even if you're just hearing about it for the first time, it seems to have originated with Columcille. He was the first one, and it was the most famous water serpent in the world, bar none. As Columcille was on the banks of the River Ness, he met a group of people who were preparing to bury a body, somebody that they knew had been attacked by a terrifying water serpent. I don't know if it was to draw the serpent out or to prove to himself that whether it was there or not, but Columcille asked one of his monks to swim across the river and fetch a boat from the other side and bring it back to them. And as the man was swimming, this enormous serpent rose up out of the water, lunged at the man Lugna, and rushed at him. And Columcille made the sign of the cross in the air with his hand and drove the creature back. But unlike some of the later serpents who swam out of the lochs and ran away or otherwise fled to the sea, this serpent turned back and dove under deep water and swam back to Loch Ness, where allegedly it is today. Years after the founding of the monastery in Iona, Columcille came back to Ireland. There was a convention at Drumcats. He was wanted, he was asked for, but if you'll remember, he was a little bit dramatic and he had taken a big dramatic vow about never setting foot on Irish soil again. So he decided to get around this in the most dramatic way possible, which was to have a sod of Scottish soil placed under his feet at every step, to wear a blindfold so that he didn't see any Irish people, and to bring food and drink with him from Scotland so that he did not taste any food or drink from Ireland, which must have been just a really interesting presence at that particular convention. Just a guy in a blindfold, not eating anything, with his feet on sod from a different country. As is appropriate for a saint who was famous for his prophecy, Columcille foretold his own death. He knew when he was going to die and he announced it to his monks on Iona. As the hour approached, he decided to go outside and sit in the granary. And as he was sitting there was this milk-white horse that used to carry the milk for the monks. And the horse galloped up to Columcille, laid its head on his lap and started weeping. And the other monks tried to drive the horse away, but Columcille said, no, let him alone because he loves me. Which is very sweet. He was nice to horses, I guess. He then very neatly had time to appoint his successor, go into the chapel, die on the altar, and he died at night, and so a huge pillar of light was seen in the sky as his soul ascended up into heaven. So, as you might expect from a saint who could see into the future, he had time to get his affairs in order, and he had time to, say goodbye to his pet and say goodbye to his friends and make sure everything was good and go out the way he wanted to. As to how he finished up in Downpatrick, if you remember at the start of the video I mentioned that this was the kind of rhyme that I learned in primary school. I'm sure I'm not the only Irish kid who had to learn that in the 80s. There's this idea that Columcille was buried side by side with Patrick and Bridget in Downpatrick. There's no evidence for this, but there is a story. And the story goes that, of course, naturally, Columcille was buried in Iona. Many, many years later, Norse raiders came to Iona in hopes of plundering the shrine. And when they dug up the coffin, they found there was no treasure, but they found, the saint's body. And being raiders who were interested in gold, they threw the body and the coffin into the water, where it floated to the shores of Ireland. And on the shores of Ireland, a cow licked the coffin of the saint and suddenly started producing an incredible quantity of milk. And the local townspeople noticed this unusual yield from this one particular cow and decided to investigate how this had come about, and somehow managed to trace the cow's steps back to the beach and the coffin. And when they opened the coffin, they recognised the body of the saint. I think there's a thing in the lives of saints where they're not supposed to decay, where their bodies don't decay for a long time. So I don't know if that's why or if it was marked in some way. The story's not clear. Anyway, they contacted the church. The local monks in the area brought the coffin to Downpatrick. And after they got to Downpatrick, they found that the graves, the side-by-side graves of St. Bridget and St. Patrick, had scooched to give room to bury Columcille in them. So even though he renounced Ireland in life, he was able to be buried in Irish soil in death and reunite with the other great Irish saints. So let us know in the comments if you liked this video. You can give it a like. If you'd like to see more things about Irish mythology and culture, please subscribe, follow us, come along. We have many, many videos and we have many, 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 many stories. And let us know if you've heard about Columcille before. Had you heard stories about him? Were there any stories that we left out? And are there any other topics that you would like us to cover on this channel? And we will see you in the next one. You!